7 dogs are moving through the dark, not running, not panicking, moving together, low and deliberate, across a highway overpass at 2 a.m., through fields, past villages, in the same direction they were traveling before the truck took them. They have been gone for 17 kilometers. They have no map. One of them is injured, and they are still moving. Most people watching this land in one of two places. The dogs were following their instincts, or the dogs loved their owners enough to find their way back. Both of those things are true. Neither of them is actually what's happening here, because the scientists who have spent the last decade studying how dogs navigate, bond, and make collective decisions have ended up with something that sounds almost nothing like either explanation. And once you hear it, this story starts to look completely different. What you are about to hear is a documented event. 7 dogs from the same village in China were stolen by a meat trader and loaded into a transport truck. Somewhere on that journey, they chewed through the cage, keeping them inside. They found a way out, and then rather than scatter, they stayed together and walked more than 10 miles back toward home. Every detail in this video is real. The science behind why they did it has been building for 2 decades. There is one dog at the front, a Corgi. His name is Da Pong, which translates loosely to big fat. He is not the largest dog in the group, he is not the strongest, but in nearly every piece of footage and every first-hand account from the rescuers who found them, he is in front, and every few minutes, he stops, turns around, counts, waits for the others to close the gap before moving again. Most people call that loyalty. That is the wrong word. Not because it's inaccurate, but because it's too small. Loyalty implies a feeling. What Da Pang is doing has a measurable neurological architecture. In 2011, a research team at the Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest conducted a series of experiments on group navigation in domestic dogs. They found that when dogs travel as a unit under high-stress conditions, unfamiliar terrain, perceived threat, absent owner, one animal consistently emerged as a reference point for the others. Not because it was dominant, not because it was trained, because it was the most behaviorally stable member of the group, the dog that checked back most frequently, the dog whose cortisol response was most regulated. The researchers called this role the social anchor. What made that finding striking was the next layer. The Budapest team didn't just observe the anchor, they measured the physiological cascade it produced in the other dogs. When the anchor stopped and turned, the heart rate variability in the following dogs stabilized within seconds. Not minutes, seconds. The mere act of seeing a calm, oriented animal pause and look back was enough to down-regulate the stress response in the animals behind it. The anchor wasn't communicating a plan, it was communicating a state, and the other nervous systems were reading it and updating in real time. The researchers also noted something about what happened when the anchor was temporarily removed from the group. Forward movement slowed by an average of 34%. The group didn't collapse, but it compressed, huddled, and stopped making progress until a new reference point emerged. The group doesn't follow the anchor because they've been told to. They follow it because stability, in a frightened nervous system, is the most credible signal available. Da Pang wasn't leading because he knew the way. He was leading because he was the most capable of not falling apart, and that is why the others stayed close. There is something else happening in the middle of this group. One of the 7 is a German Shepherd. His leg has been injured. Accounts vary on how, likely in the escape from the truck. He cannot keep pace, and what the rescuers who found the dogs described is that the group had arranged itself around him. 2 smaller dogs on his left flank, one behind. The formation wasn't random, it was load-bearing. Here's what this is not: sentiment. In 2018, a team at the Animal Behavior Institute in Vienna published findings on proximity clustering in multi-dog groups during navigational stress. What they found was that dogs in groups will spontaneously form physical buffers around a compromised member, not out of empathy in any abstract sense, but because the group's survival calculus has shifted. A group that loses a member becomes smaller. A smaller group is less able to defend, forage, or navigate. The protective arrangement around the shepherd is not kindness, it is distributed risk management. But there is a second mechanism underneath the formation, and it is more specific than that. The Vienna researchers tracked not just where the dogs positioned themselves, but how those positions changed in response to the injured dog's gait. When the shepherd slowed, the flanking dogs slowed first, before any vocalization, before any obvious signal. They were reading micro-changes in posture and movement rhythm, and adjusting their own behavior in advance of the need. The researchers described this as anticipatory alignment, the ability to model another animal's likely next state and pre-position accordingly. It had been documented before in wolves. This was one of the first times it was observed in a domestic dog group operating without any human direction at all. What this tells us is that the formation around the shepherd is not a static arrangement. It is a dynamic one, constantly recalibrating based on real-time information about the most vulnerable member. The group is not surrounding him because they decided to. The group is surrounding him because that is what thousands of years of cooperative behavior produces when the conditions are right. It is written into the cooperative behavior of dogs at a level that predates domestication by thousands of years. The group is not being generous. The group is being rational in exactly the way evolution designed them to be. Now here is the part that changes everything. Here's what none of this is: coincidence. In 2010, researchers at the Broad Institute used whole genome sequencing to trace the divergence point between domestic dogs and the wolf populations they descended from. What they found embedded in the domestic dog genome were structural changes in a cluster of genes, among them variants in GTF2I and GTF2IRD1. These are the same genes whose deletion, in humans, causes Williams-Buren syndrome, a condition characterized by an almost complete absence of social wariness, a compulsive orientation toward others, and a powerful, nearly involuntary drive to maintain proximity to familiar individuals, even under conditions that would cause most animals to scatter and self-preserve. Wolves don't carry these variants. They emerged specifically during domestication, and this is where it gets precise in a way that matters. The Broad Institute team didn't just identify the variants. They mapped when in the domestication timeline, the selection pressure for them intensified. It wasn't during the earliest period, when wolves first began scavenging around human settlements. It was later, during the period researchers believe corresponds to active human selection for working and companion roles. The genome wasn't just shaped by proximity to humans. It was shaped by humans choosing, generation after generation, the individuals most oriented toward them, most willing to stay near, most capable of reading and responding to human social signals. The genetic variants we're talking about are not a side effect of domestication. They are the record of an intentional, if unconscious, breeding program that ran for thousands of years and had one central criterion: does this animal want to be near us? There is a further finding from a 2017 replication study at Princeton that adds another layer. When the researchers compared the expression levels of these gene variants across different dog breeds, they found that the variants were present in virtually all of them, but their expression was modulated by early social experience. A dog that had extensive positive contact with its primary social group in the first 16 weeks of life showed significantly higher expression of the bonding-related gene cluster than one that had been isolated. The genome creates the architecture, experience activates it. What this means for the 7 village dogs who had roamed together since puppyhood, who had shared territory, who had formed a stable social unit over months, is that they were not just genetically predisposed toward this kind of behavior. Their early experience had turned those predispositions up as far as they go. What this means is that when these 7 dogs escaped a moving vehicle in the middle of the night and chose, with total independence, to travel together toward the place and the people they came from, they were not overcoming their nature. They were expressing it at maximum volume. Most people watching this will carry one belief into this story: that what these dogs did is exceptional, that this level of bond, the kind that survives a theft, an injury, a 17-kilometer journey through dark terrain, is rare. The research says something different. In 2019, a team at the Clever Dog Lab in Vienna conducted a longitudinal study of 43 multi-dog households. They tracked spatial proximity, group behavior during owner absence, and navigation performance in novel environments. The finding that surprised the researchers most was this: dogs who had formed stable social bonds with each other before a disruption performed significantly better on every measure of survival-relevant behavior during the disruption than dogs who had not. 71% better on novel navigation tasks, 58% better on group cohesion under threat. The bond wasn't just emotional infrastructure, it was operational infrastructure. But the study went further. The researchers introduced a controlled stressor, a sudden loud noise in an unfamiliar environment, and measured the recovery time for bonded versus unbonded dog pairs. Bonded dogs returned to baseline behavior in an average of 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Unbonded dogs took more than 11 minutes, and in several cases never fully settled during the observation window. The bonded dogs were not less afraid. Their initial startle response was identical. They were simply faster at recovering because they had a social reference point to recover toward, a known animal whose regulated state could pull their own nervous system back down. The bond was functioning as a biological co-regulation system, each dog literally using the other's physiology to stabilize its own. The dog that knows where its companions are, that has practiced moving with them, that has established a shared reference point. That dog is measurably more capable when things go wrong. The 7 dogs from the village didn't survive the journey because they were lucky. They survived it because they had spent months building exactly the kind of social architecture the research says produces outcomes like this. And one more thing, before we come back to that road. Researchers studying canine homing behavior have long debated the mechanism. Magnetic field sensitivity has been demonstrated in several mammalian species, including dogs. A 2013 study published in Frontiers in Zoology found that dogs preferentially align their bodies along the north-south magnetic axis during certain behaviors, evidence that they are, in some measurable sense, orientating relative to the Earth's magnetic field. That study was followed in 2020 by imaging research at the University of Duisburg-Essen, which identified a cluster of magnetite crystals in the ethmoid region of the canine skull, the same bony cavity that sits between the eyes and the nasal passage. Magnetite is the same iron-rich mineral that has been identified in the navigation systems of migratory birds and certain fish species. It responds physically to changes in the Earth's magnetic field. What this means, structurally, is that dogs may have a dedicated sensory apparatus for geomagnetic orientation built into the architecture of their skull, not metaphorically, but literally, a compass made of bone and mineral sitting in the middle of their face. Whether this alone is sufficient to account for a 10-mile navigation through unknown terrain is still contested. But the most current hypothesis from spatial cognition researchers is not that the dogs used a single mechanism. It is that they used several: olfactory trail memory, landmark recognition, magnetic sensitivity, and social reinforcement between group members, layered on top of each other, each one compensating for the limitations of the others. The olfactory system fills in where magnetic orientation is ambiguous. Landmark recognition confirms what scent suggests. The social group prevents any individual from straying off a route that the others are tracking differently. Each system is a check on the others, not instinct, architecture. So here is what is actually happening in that moment on the highway at 2 a.m. Dapang is not simply walking home. He is functioning as a mobile social anchor for 6 other nervous systems, producing a regulated physiological state that the other dogs are reading and mirroring, pulling their cortisol responses down with every backward glance, managing group cohesion in exactly the way the Budapest team described, at intervals, with purpose, without a single conscious decision being made. He is carrying in the architecture of his skull a navigation system that may be reading the Earth's own magnetic field, and embedded in his genome, activated by every week he spent roaming with these animals before tonight, is the variant that makes separation feel intolerable and return feel like the only available direction. The shepherd at the center of the group is not being helped by dogs who chose to be kind. He is being carried by a distributed survival network, a real-time, dynamically recalibrating formation of animals using anticipatory alignment to pre-position around his weakness before he shows it. The formation exists because the bond existed first. The bond is not a feeling. It is a biological system with measurable components, a developmental history, and a genomic foundation that was laid down thousands of years before any of these dogs were born. And the village these dogs were walking toward, the houses, the owners, the man who would later say, "We are so lucky they came back, not to be eaten," that is not just a destination. It is the secure base, the reference point, the thing that makes the dark navigable, the thing the research has been trying to name for 20 years in language that keeps coming up short. These dogs were not saved by courage. They were saved by everything they had built together in the months before anyone knew they would need it. By a genome that made leaving feel wrong and returning feel necessary. By a Corgi who stopped and turned around often enough that 6 other animals kept their nerve through 17 kilometers of unfamiliar dark. The owners got their dogs back, not because the dogs were exceptional, because they were exactly what dogs are built to be. Leave a comment below. Which of the 7 do you think led the moment they got out of that truck before Dapang took the front, and what makes you say so?